Dear students and audience, greetings of the day. I welcome you to this session on Acts and Laws in Tourism Industry, Unit 21 under TS5 Ecology, Environment and Tourism. The topic of tourism law usually has a close connection with peripheral development, environmental negligence, but unfortunately, we neglect it in its entirety. Here, we'll try to dive deep into the subject and see how it has evolved over the years. After this session, you would be able to understand, like other industries, tourism also functions within the orbit of a legal framework. The legal framework arises out of surroundings, the society in which the said industry functions. The legal framework evolves from the society's customs and conventions, need of that sector, jurisdictional power of the state, as well as stakeholders standing for social and environmental justice. And many a time there is a gap observed between the laws made in a society and their implementation, unfortunately. Introduction. The purpose of law is to create an atmosphere where will of the individual, while being given room for free play, does not impinge on the rest of community. Likewise, tourism industry makes it clear that while the industry's constituents, the tourists, the tour operators, managers of tourism products, etc., they do function within the orbit of laws, which, while allowing tourism to develop, do not adversely affect the social, economical, and environmental concerns of the rest of the society. Tourism laws are derived from variety of sources: national law, international treaties, customary law, private autonomy. There is no such law that encompasses all aspects of tourism, though the demand for one has been picking up. It has been argued, in fact, that legislation on tourism seeks to define in clear, unambiguous terms the right and responsibilities of its various segments vis-a-vis the user and vice versa, and to provide for legal protection of the rights and enforcements of the responsibilities thus defined. Quite a detailed one out there. Customs and conventions. These are an important source for framing laws. Customs and conventions of a society differ from region to region and obviously from country to country. These are rooted in the history and culture of the concerned society. To take an example, a tour operator is organizing a tour to a pilgrimage site across India. Custom and conventions have taken on their own shape. Specialized function of worship are performed by local or appointed community, while the state administration looks after law and order and health administration. However, with Hu Parikar report of 1972, this distinction was sought to be blurred and the government undertook the responsibility of conducting the entire proceedings. This led to considerable disputes. Therefore, a tourist operator today needs to be sensitive to these issues while taking his group to the pilgrimage site. It is equally important to understand existing legislation and control measures such as regulations in order to ensure that they properly adhere to the planning and management of tourism activities and development of all stakeholders. A case in point is Javara tribes in Andamans. We ought to respect their cultures and traditions. Therefore, legislation and control measures available for the implementation of overall vision implementation, goal and objective for tourism development and biodiversity should be reviewed to assess its effectiveness, including enforcement and repetition of any gaps that needs to be addressed. For example, revision or development of additional legislation and control measures. Although it can be time consuming, but changing legislation is an excellent long-term goal for many projects, as tourism is frequently inadequately regulated. It is a progressively easier to modify regulations. Legal and jurisdiction power of the state. Any nation state today is founded on the bedrock of laws enacted by the state itself. Depending on the nature of state, whether democratic or authoritarian, these laws vary. Tourism industry needs to take these fundamental facts into account while shaping its agenda. Restrictive rules and regulations probably can create problems with a planned tour. For example, countries with restriction on freedom, for example, Saudi Arabia, can lead to fairly restricted kind of tourism. Whereas countries like India facilitate interaction with Indian ethnicity and culture in a more in-depth fashion. However, Even democratic countries impose restrictions. In India, inner line permits are needed for assessing some parts of Northeast India. According to UNWTO, the purpose of travel legislation is to provide a regulatory framework for the proper development and management of tourism activities. Ideally, this will aid in conservation of natural resources and preservation of cultural traditions, environment, and the Indian state. In India too, the state has intervened significantly to protect its environment in wake of tourism. Regulation concerning tiger show or protection of animals are case in point. The Indian Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 provides protection to much of the Indian flora and fauna. As a consequence, India has 66 national parks, 333 wildlife sanctuaries, and 35 zoological gardens. Under the Act, severe penalties are imposed upon violators. There are also specific acts regarding conservation and preservation which relate to both environment and heritage. These establish various environmental and heritage zones, offer special facilities to visitors, and regulate visitor behavior as well. Need to develop environmental impact control measures also means that taking other development measures into account, thus acting holistically and in tandem with road development, building compliances, forest and wildlife acts, to name a few. Apart from environment and health, the state in India also intervenes through regulation concerning passport and visa requirements, special permits for restricted area, custom regulations, to name a few. Similarly, law and order problems which could arise in the context of visitor-host interface are handled by the state itself. Concerns of the functioning of private sector. The private sector in our country also imposes its own demand on the state of regulation and law. Historically, growth of market and industry has been posed as a problem for the modern state. Like in England, India too went through the debate on free trade. Opening of our economy in the 90s paved path for the unprecedented development that is today enjoyed by one and all. But historically, concerns for protection of environment in colonies with the passing of various Woods and Forest Acts as well as laws abolishing trade in slaves, etc., were much debated topics. It should be pointed out that the concerns for straight regulation even here were diverted by needs of a growing industrial revolution which wanted to create its social base. Laws of British state. In India, industry developed after the restrictions imposed on free trade by British colonial government. Therefore, protective regulation was its foundation stone. The debate on new liberalized free trade economy today needs to be understood in this context. Licensing laws were set up by the Indian state to direct the industry towards concerns of the state. However, these came in the way to entrepreneurship need of industry. Hence, we see the dismantling of these laws today, thus entrepreneurship taking a leap forward. Tourism industry in itself has undergone to absorb the fluctuation of such change. From the stage of curious traders and oriental onlookers under colonialism, the inflow from abroad has increased to diversify of cultural heritage and eco-tourists. This diversification has sustained under the larger debate of liberalization versus control which the rest of industry has undergone through. Thus, the foreign exchange regulations work within strict currency laws. Import and export of Indian currency is subject to strict controls. Similarly, the license systems has ensured that small operators and entrepreneurs found it difficult to work their way up in a monopoly environment. By and large, demands of the monopoly tourism industry led to legislation which protected its domestic trade from international competition. These prevailed mostly in hotels and catering sector. Hence, the results were highly priced accommodation on the other hand and accommodations without any quality of service on the other hand. Similar development has taken place in catering industry as well. While liberalization of the economy with some competition was offered to established monopolies, but we are yet to see any quality growth of small entrepreneurship. Existing legislations like one on quality control, lodging lights, privacy of guests, fire security therefore remain mostly on paper. Good thing is evolution is taking place off late, but we need more of it taking place in times to come. Concerns voiced by groups fighting for social and environmental justice. This is an important and a major source of legislation as a whole. Over the years, social and environmental issues have interlocked. Government and political parties have had to sit up and listen to these concerns. Often, the issues come up in the wake of developmental strategies pursued by different nations. For example, in India, setting up of big dams like at the Narmada led to protests against displacement of people living in that area and demand for regulating the height of them. Similarly, Chipko movement in India created need for environmental sustainability legislation. However, the impact of environmental legislation has a deeper implication for tourism. The question of displacement of people or degradation of environment leads to planners to rethink their strategies for tourism. Therefore, acts and laws on hotel, catering industry or construction of resorts ought to reflect it. Thus, we see in Goa that there is a legal limit placed on number of shanties or hotels that can be built across the beaches. More importantly, acts and laws designated to protect wildlife and vulnerable ecozones actually decide the direction in which tourism in the country can move. Example, Wildlife Protection Acts ensure that there is no killing of animals for hunting or pleasure, unfortunately, which is going on in some part of the world. Similarly, laws on protection of displaced people create a sense of ethnic cultures, and this has created a new kind of tourism called ethnic tourism, where the tourists interact with local community with full respect to their culture and tradition. For policymakers, an environmental justice oriented framework that includes cultural justice as part of cultural sustainability can help to address matters of procedural justice. For local residents, active participation in the development of the cultural sustainability framework and cultural indicators is crucial, as it is their direct participation in development and conservation initiatives. It can help them to have control over which aspects of these culture and their ecotourism goals they would like to share and how best to maintain those human environment relationships that value, hence facilitating cultural survival as well. Awareness and support for conservation may also increase in times to come. Jurisdiction. In India, lawmaking is function of national parliaments, state legislatures, and local or municipal bodies. The jurisdiction of these bodies is defined by the Indian Constitution. However, in an area like tourism, there can be many overlaps. For example, tourism education would be a subject for legislation by the state legislature, while regulation of foreign and Indian currency would be in the hand of central parliament. Similarly, laws regarding pollution, waste disposal, etc. could be specific and different for local bodies like municipalities and panchayats. Clearly, a tourism person in India would have to be sensitive to both local and national context as far as legislation on any context of tourism development is concerned. Similarly, it would be more important for him to know the dynamics of lawmaking processes rather than learn all the laws and acts passed by various bodies. Of course, working for this particular context, he would have to know the acts and laws at least with respect to his own areas of operation. Currently, there are various legislations that directly or indirectly affect tourism. They can be categorized under the following heads. Laws reflecting of transboundary movements like customs, laws related to transportation like airlines regulation, laws related to accommodation, laws related to land use infrastructure, customer protection laws related to health hygiene, laws related to functioning of tourism organization at various levels, conservation related laws, laws related to human resource, and laws for regulating the service provider, ETS. In spite of many legislation and claims of rule of law, a country's legal system ultimately is defined by its institutional context. The strength of its institution comes from the political morale, will to stick to a law of land. In the Indian case, we have seen over the years a weakening of this political will. Similarly, laws relating to waste, pollution, and tourist flow go disregarded. Consequently, a great stress and strain is placed on the carrying capacity of eco niche in spite of existing laws. To sum up, tourism is an arena rife with justice issues and acts of injustices despite all efforts to characterize it as a commercial activity free of ethnic concerns. As we have demonstrated here, powerful interest gains benefit from exploring, marginalizing, and disposing local communities in an effort to gain profit from tourism development. While efforts to attain sustainability outcomes in tourism means that some big NGOs have made some gains in developing policies and measures to address environmental concerns, we argue that environmental justice concerns being articulated by grassroots communities and advocated for by local groups will be essential for achievement of these sustainable changes. The advocacy of these tourism NGOs we have highlighted here suggests that justice and equity comes from a grassroots, bottoms-up approach. We have highlighted here that justice and equity comes from grassroots, bottoms-up approach and not from top-down imposition of interventions by global players like UNWTO. We argue that there is a need for much greater emphasis in research on relationship between environmental justice and tourism. This is especially important to the global south and to indigenous people around the globe. We argue also that there is an urgent need for more support for NGOs so as to highlight these issues as stated above. To sum up, we provide you an exercise to sum up our lesson. Try to make up notes on the below topics. How national and regional concerns interplay in policy and formulation of tourism legislation. What has been the impact of free trade on countries' development? Try to make a critical analysis with respect to overall development perspective. How wildlife and beach tourism legislation affect overall development of the place? Is it worth it or need further strengthening and dovetail? Thank you so very much.